The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was not merely a geopolitical victory for the United States. It was a narcotic. For a fleeting moment in human history, Washington stood atop the world without a peer, possessed of an economic and military dominance that Rome at its zenith could only have dreamed of. But in that moment of absolute triumph lay the seeds of our current unraveling. We became drunk on the end of history narrative, the seductive idea that liberal democracy and free market capitalism were the final form of human government, and that the United States was its eternal guardian. This was not just optimism. It was a dangerous hubris that blinded us to the immutable laws of power politics. We convinced ourselves that we had transcended history, that we could rewrite the rules of the international order because we were the indispensable nation. We failed to see that unipolarity is, by its very nature, a temporary aberration, not a permanent state. In the 1990s, we had a choice. We could have built a truly inclusive security architecture that integrated a defeated Russia and a rising China into a balanced global system. Instead, we chose the path of primacy. The Wolfowitz Doctrine, drafted in the Pentagon in 1992, laid it out explicitly. Our first objective was to prevent the reemergence of a new rival. We decided that our security depended not on stability, but on dominance. We expanded NATO not because we needed to, but because we could. We pushed the alliance eastward, violating the spirit of the assurances given to Gorbachev, treating Russia not as a potential partner to be cultivated, but as a defeated conquest to be contained. We ignored the warnings of our greatest strategic minds, Kennan, Kissinger, Matlock, who told us that humiliating a great power, no matter how temporarily weak, would inevitably breed a revanchist backlash. We are living through that backlash now. While we were expanding our military footprint, we were simultaneously weaponizing the very infrastructure of globalization we claimed to uphold. This is perhaps the most critical, yet least understood aspect of American decline. For decades, we told the world that the U.S. dollar, the SWIFT banking system, and the freedom of navigation were global public goods, neutral utilities for the benefit of all mankind. But post 9/11, and accelerating dramatically after 2014, we turned these utilities into weapons of war. We developed a sanctions industrial complex. We began to use the centrality of the U.S. financial system to enforce our foreign policy dictates, punishing not just our adversaries, but our allies if they dared to trade with the wrong countries. We fined European banks billions of dollars for facilitating legal trade with Iran. We cut nations off from the dollar, effectively exiling them from the modern world. We thought this was a clever, bloodless way to project power. We were wrong. By weaponizing the dollar, we destroyed the trust that underpinned its dominance. The decision to freeze $300 billion of Russian central bank assets in 2022 was the crossing of the Rubicon. It sent a shockwave through Beijing, Riyadh, Brasilia, and New Delhi. The message was unmistakable. Your sovereign reserves are not safe if you cross Washington. This singular act did more to accelerate de-dollarization than any speech by Putin or Xi ever could. We created the incentive structure for our rivals to build a parallel financial system. We forced them to innovate. Now we see the rise of the petro-yuan, the increasing use of local currencies in bilateral trade, and the expansion of the BRICS alliance. We assumed the world had no choice but to use the dollar. We forgot that necessity is the mother of invention. We have incentivized the creation of a sanction-proof global economy, one that will ultimately render our financial leverage obsolete. While we were busy policing the world and engaging in nation-building experiments in the Middle East, trillions of dollars wasted in the sands of Iraq and Afghanistan, we allowed the very foundation of our hard power to rot. We embraced a neoliberal economic model that prioritized financial efficiency and short-term shareholder value over industrial resilience. We offshored our manufacturing base to the very rival we are now trying to contain, China. The strategic insanity of this cannot be overstated. We voluntarily transferred our industrial capacity, our supply chains, and our dual-use technologies to our primary geopolitical competitor, believing that economic integration would inevitably turn China into a docile, democratic stakeholder. It was a gamble of breathtaking naivety. China didn't liberalize. It weaponized the prosperity we helped it achieve. It used our capital to build a blue water navy that now rivals our own in numbers, if not yet in tonnage. Today, the United States faces a crisis of production. The war in Ukraine has exposed the fragility of the Western defense industrial base. We have discovered, to our horror, that financial derivatives and tech apps do not win high-intensity attrition wars. Artillery shells, missiles, and drones do. And we can no longer produce them at scale. We have a GDP based on services and consumption, while our adversaries have economies based on real production. In a protracted great power conflict, you cannot fight with GDP numbers on a spreadsheet. You need steel, chemicals, energy, and assembly lines. We dismantled ours in the name of globalization, leaving us dangerously exposed. We are a maritime superpower that struggles to build ships, while China churns them out at a rate we cannot match. We have become the, quote, six, in name only, lacking the industrial forge to back up our strategic commitments. Our decline is also moral and diplomatic. For 30 years, we have lectured the, quote, seven, the nations of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, about the, quote, eight. But to them, this order looks like a hierarchy where the rules are written by the West and applied only to the rest. They watched us invade Iraq based on fabricated intelligence, violating the very UN charter we claim to hold sacred. They watched us use, quote, 9 in Libya to execute a regime change that left the country in chaos. They watched us support autocrats when it suited our interests, while preaching democracy to others. The result is that the global South has stopped listening. When the Ukraine crisis erupted, Washington expected the world to line up behind us in condemning Russia. Instead, the vast majority of the world's population, India, Brazil, South Africa, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, refused to join the sanctions regime. This was a seismic shock to the State Department, which could not comprehend why these nations wouldn't follow our lead. The answer is simple. They view the conflict in Europe as a regional war, not a global moral crusade. They see our hypocrisy. They remember our silence during their own conflicts. Moreover, China and Russia have offered them something we stopped offering decades ago: tangible development without lectures. While we send NGOs to preach about gender identity or climate governance, China sends engineers to build bridges, ports, and power plants. Russia sends security guarantees and cheap energy. We offer moral judgment. They offer material transaction. In a world of scarcity and instability, transaction wins. We have lost the battle for hearts and minds not because our propaganda is weak, but because our product is broken. We act like a hegemon, but we no longer deliver the public goods, security, and prosperity that justify hegemony. The ultimate tragedy of American foreign policy in the 21st century is that we created the very monsters we now fear. By treating Russia as an enemy when it was weak, we guaranteed it would become an enemy when it recovered. By trying to contain China through military encirclement rather than accommodating its rise within a reformed system, we validated Beijing's paranoia and hardened its resolve to displace us. By weaponizing the global economy, we forced the creation of a post-American economic order. The we face today, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, is not a natural alliance. These countries have deep historical grievances and conflicting interests. Russia and China are natural competitors in Central Asia. Iran is a revolutionary theocracy, while China is a secular communist state. What binds them together? Only one thing: American pressure. We are the glue that holds the anti-Western coalition together. Every sanction we impose, every carrier group we deploy, every lecture we deliver, drives them closer into a survival pact. We are now witnessing the crystallization of a multipolar world. It is messy, dangerous, and volatile. The comfortable predictability of the unipolar moment is gone, never to return. The danger now is that Washington, unable to accept this new reality, will lash out. A dying empire is often more dangerous than a rising one. We see this in the desperate rhetoric coming out of the Beltway, the talk of, quote, and, quote, competitions that cannot be won, only managed. The Monroe Doctrine is dead because we lack the capacity to enforce it unilaterally. The global dollar system is dying because we abuse the trust required to maintain it. The quote is collapsing because we failed to live up to its principles. This is not quote. It is a cold, hard reckoning with the consequences of our own choices. We must understand that the sight of Russian warships in Havana or Chinese spy balloons over the Midwest are not isolated incidents of aggression. They are symptoms of a systemic rebalancing. The vacuum we created by our incompetence and overreach is being filled. Nature abhors a vacuum, and geopolitics abhors a retreating hegemon that refuses to admit it is retreating. The mainstream media continues to sell a narrative of a simplistic Marvel movie version of international relations where America is always the hero and our rivals are cartoon villains acting out of irrational malice. This narrative is not just false, it is dangerous. It prevents us from engaging in the necessary self-reflection to correct our course. It keeps us trapped in a cycle of escalation. We double down on failed policies, more sanctions, more weapons, more rhetoric, hoping that if we just push hard enough, the world will snap back to how it was in 1995. It won't. The 1990s were an anomaly. The history of the world is the history of multipolarity, of great power competition, of spheres of influence. We are returning to the historical norm. The question is not how we defeat this new reality, but how we survive it. Can the United States learn to be a normal nation again? Can we accept that we are a great power among other great powers, rather than the God King of the planet? If we can accept this, we can secure our interests, rebuild our economy, and coexist in a complex world. We still possess immense advantages: geography, demographics, natural resources, and a culture of innovation. But if we continue to cling to the delusion of unipolar dominance, if we continue to mistake our desires for reality, we will exhaust ourselves in futile conflicts abroad, while our society crumbles from within. The arrival of the multipolar world is not the end of America, but it is the end of the American empire. The sooner we accept this distinction, the safer we and the rest of the world will be. But looking at the current leadership in Washington, trapped in the dogmas of the past, I fear we will rage against the dying of the light, dragging the world into darkness with us, rather than lighting a candle to find our way in this new, unfamiliar century. The ships off the coast of Venezuela are not just a warning. They are a tombstone for the Monroe Doctrine and a harbinger of the post-American world. The only variable left is how gracefully, or violently, we choose to accept the inevitable. To fully understand the collapse of American external power, one must also look inward at the fraying social fabric that makes coherent grand strategy impossible. A nation that cannot define itself cannot lead the world. In the mid-20th century, despite internal divisions, there was a broad consensus on the American identity and its role in the world. Politics ended at the water's edge. Today, our foreign policy is schizophrenic, oscillating wildly with every election cycle. Allies cannot trust our commitments because they know a treaty signed by one administration might be torn up by the next. This volatility is a poison to alliances. Furthermore, the quote that was once our greatest asset has atrophied. The American dream was once a universal aspiration. Today, the world sees a fragmented society, consumed by culture wars, paralyzed by political polarization, and plagued by violence and inequality. When Chinese diplomats want to counter American lectures on human rights, they simply point to our own crumbling cities and social unrest. We have lost the power of example. We cannot export stability when we import chaos. This internal weakness emboldens our adversaries. They calculate that America is too distracted, too divided, and too debt-ridden to sustain a long-term conflict. They read our budget debates, they watch our gridlocked Congress, and they see opportunity. They understand that the greatest threat to the United States is not in Moscow or Beijing, but in Washington, D.C. itself. The obsession with short-term political wins over long-term strategic planning has left us rudderless. We are a superpower on autopilot, coasting on the momentum of past glories while the engine sputters. Finally, we must address the technological delusion. For decades, we assumed that innovation was an American birthright. We believed that the Internet, AI, and quantum computing would inherently favor open, democratic societies. We were wrong. The rise of the, quote, 18 state proves that technology is value neutral. It can be used to liberate, but it can just as easily be used to control. China's rapid ascent up the value chain, from making cheap plastic toys to leading the world in 5G, electric vehicles, and hypersonic missiles, shattered the illusion that they would forever remain a low-cost manufacturing hub. The chip war we have launched, banning the export of advanced semiconductors to China, is a desperate rearguard action. It is an admission that we can no longer outrun them. We must try to trip them. But history shows that technology blockades rarely work in the long run against a nation with the resources and human capital of China. It only forces them to indigenize their supply chains faster, By trying to freeze China's technological development, we have launched a technological Cold War that threatens to bifurcate the world into incompatible digital ecosystems. This fragmentation will hurt American tech giants who rely on global markets. It creates a world where standards are split, where the internet is balkanized, and where American tech hegemony is challenged by a digital Silk Road. We are moving from a world of one world, one internet, to a splinternet. In this new landscape, American power is not universal. It is bounded. The trajectory is clear. The unipolar moment was a historical anomaly, born of a unique set of circumstances in 1991 that will never be repeated. The attempt to perpetuate it artificially has cost us blood, treasure, and credibility. The Russian ships in the Caribbean, the BRICS summit in South Africa, the drone strikes in the Red Sea. These are all messages from a world that has moved on. The United States remains a formidable power, arguably still the strongest single nation. But we are no longer the only power. The difference between being the hegemon and being primus inter pares, first among equals, is the difference between giving orders and negotiating deals. We have forgotten how to negotiate. We have forgotten the art of diplomacy, replacing it with the brute force of sanctions and threats. If we wish to preserve the American way of life, we must abandon the American empire. We must bring our resources home to rebuild our nation, secure our own borders, and revitalize our own industry. We must interact with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. Long live a new realism. But until that realization takes hold in the halls of power, we will continue to drift, a titan blinded by its own shadow, stumbling toward a precipice of our own making. The world has changed. It is time we changed with it.